Hello, and welcome to More Than Sunday, a weekly podcast where we take a deeper dive into the stories, themes, and questions of our faith. My name is Eric Chikowski, and I'm the worship director for Access, our modern worship community at First United Methodist Church Richardson. And with me every week is our lead pastor, Julie Richter.
Hey, Eric, guess what time it is?
What time is it?
It is time for football.
Football time!
It has been long awaited, and I could not be more excited.
I love my alma mater. I'm a proud Mustang.
Yes,
Go
you
Ponies. Went to SMU.
You poor thing.
Okay, Julie's a Horned Frog,
Go
TCU.
Frogs.
Sorry. And so we did beat you guys one time.
One time.
I'm a proud Mustang, but our college football team is not always as good as I would hope. And so I tend to gravitate more toward NFL football.
Yeah.
Love the Cowboys.
Oh, yeah. So Cowboys. So I do it all. So I've got a brother who is a junior in high school. So we do Friday night football. And then Saturday is college football. And then Sunday is NFL. And I remember growing up with my family on Monday nights, we would all sort of start giggling when we'd get around the dinner table because we knew my dad would want to pray that night because he would pray for Monday night football. He would always end the prayer by saying, "And thank you for Monday night football."
I think Aaron Rodgers probably said it best when he said, "I don't know that God cares about who wins the football game."
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, maybe that's something we can pray for, but maybe not.
Yeah, it's like the official kickoff to fall.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I've got my first fantasy football draft this weekend.
Well,
so
there you go.
I'm excited. I get just a little too into it, and it's
Yeah.
probably slightly unhealthy, but I do love football season. Well, we also love this sermon series that we are in. We are in the midst of a series called This Is My Story, and we've talked the last couple of weeks just about some incredible stories. This week, we wanted to do something a little bit different. We've had the unique pleasure and joy of being able to hear some really insightful and incredible stories in the short time that we've been doing this podcast. And so today, we wanted to sort of dive back into some previous episodes and just be reminded again of some really beautiful stories of faith, stories of healing, and reminders of why we believe what we believe and why we live our lives the way that we do.
I think it's just been truly a gift, Eric, as you said, to get to be not only part of these stories, but for Eric and I, we get to sit in this room and hear them for the first time before they are on the air with the podcast. And so I've told Eric before in moments when we've just heard a really powerful story that it's been like holy moments in the headphones, sitting with some of my favorite people, some dear friends and dear colleagues, people that have been mentors in my life, and just really powerful people who have had some great stories. And this week in the sermon series, what we are talking about is characters have spine. And another way to talk about that is what motivates them? What drives a person to do what they do? And ultimately, how does it define them? And so part of the reason we wanted to talk about stories today is that the people that we are going to share or reshare these stories with you about all had defining moments that shaped their faith, that shaped their character, that ultimately shaped the way that they lived their life.
And so the first story we'd like to jump back to is a story that Gloria Scott told. Gloria had an instance in her life where the church did not live up to what I think Jesus' hopes for the church were in caring for people. And Gloria had a decision to make about how she was going to choose to continue to engage in church and continue to engage in her faith.
The defining moment came early in our marriage when my husband was in the military and went to Vietnam. And 4 of our children were with us at that time. And we moved back to the area where my parents lived. And it was a smaller town in the Midwest. Being a military family, we jumped in and were immediately involved in the community because you aren't there for a long time when you're in the military. And so you get acquainted, jump in, take responsibilities right away. So that was not foreign to me to be moving to a new place with the kids. And my parents lived in this town. It was a great chance for them to be with my parents and for me to feel their support. And I was very naive, not knowing that people didn't understand the military and this situation and with the time in society and where we were in our world and what we were doing politically. And I received that telegram that every spouse of a military person fears receiving. The telegram that said my husband was injured very seriously, that he was being air evac to Japan. And at that point, that was all I knew. For 3 months, he was in the hospital in Japan and air evac'd at the end of those 3 months to a hospital in the United States. He returned home 5 months later, a total of 5 months. But during that time, I had jumped in, was in PTA and Scouts and certainly the church and different organizations in town. And not one time did a pastor or anyone come to our home, talk to us about what was going on in our lives. And I realized sitting in church on a Sunday morning when a sermon was so politically oriented and was so down on the military, which was what my life was, I felt absolutely shunned and had no place in that church. So that was a defining moment for me. And I had two choices. I could walk away from it totally, or I could stand back, take a deep breath, and walk back in. And something helped me to walk back in and make that a priority in my life, which it had been always before. But as an adult, and when Gilla was ready to come home and could come home, we made that commitment to our family that it would always be a part of who we were, and we would not be defined by who other people assumed that we were.
So many of us probably have stories of people who were wronged by the church and left and never looked back. And yet we hear from Gloria that she and her husband Gil made a commitment to their family, that they were not going to be labeled as something that they weren't, and that at the heart of who they were faithful Christians. They were understanding that the church was run by fallible people, and they still had faith in Christ, and they still had faith in the work that the church could do through them and through their family.
The next story that we want to share with you is a story about some great work that the church is doing through a church called Church at the Square. And the pastor of that community is Jonathan Grace. And Jonathan works with a community of people who are experiencing homelessness. And their church actually meets outside in the heart of downtown Dallas. And Jonathan talks to us through the story about resurrection. But what I love about this story is that it is not what we assume about resurrection, and it is certainly not what we expect when we talk about resurrection.
Now, the other story I want to tell is about a friend of mine, also named Julie.
Yeah.
And she was a giant pain in the butt.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
You're not.
No, Eric. Cut it out.
She's this homeless woman who's addicted to crack, living on the street. And I mentioned earlier that the cottages were just a nightmare to build. 2015 was the wettest year on record in Texas in forever. So the construction constantly stopped. All these issues came up. So they were way, 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 way behind schedule. But we wanted Julie to move into the cottages. That was our goal. And she watched these things slowly get built. The frames go up and the walls go in, and hoped one of those would be her home. She would come in, I'd have coffee and sugar and cream and cups for folks. So I like to get to know folks over a cup of coffee. And she would steal all the sugar. Like I would watch her because I knew she would do it. And she was like this ninja cat, just really stealthy and quick. Because I would just turn my head for a second and look back, and she'd already emptied it, just poured the sugar into her purse and bolted for the door. And people were like yelling at her and trying to fight her and like, let's calm down. But one day she comes in, picks her head in the door. Hey, Pastor, got a cup of coffee? Sure, Julie, come on in. And we started talking, and I turned my back, and she stole a whole bag of sugar. And so I said, you are stealing from your fellow homeless neighbors. You need to stop that. And I just lost it. She yelled at me. I yelled at her. I followed her into the street yelling at her, and words were exchanged I won't use right here. We're in the middle of the street making this huge scene, and I walk away like, I'm done working with Julie. I'm done with her. I've done enough for her. Screw it. And the next morning she comes in and she says, Pastor, I'm really sorry about what I did. I'm sorry to overreact. I shouldn't have yelled at you. That was inappropriate. And I'm so sorry. But you understand you're stealing from your neighbors. Yeah, I understand that. And I'm going to stop doing it. Thank you. Got a cup of coffee? Absolutely. Let's talk. So we had this ongoing, really strange relationship. But she was really difficult to work with, quick to anger, quick to make others mad, but loved her anyway in some weird way, some weird Jesus-y way. Just love people that you don't know how you love them. And so as the cottages were almost complete, her daughter, knowing that new life was coming for her, gave her a car. Like, Mom, you're about to get off the street. I'm going to give you this car. I want to get you, the transportation, all that. That's a huge problem a lot of homeless folks have, is just physically getting places. At this time, she also made a decision that I'm sure the listeners and all of us in this room will agree was a good one. She decided to get off of crack. She gave up drugs. And her drug dealer did not appreciate this. As you can imagine, drug dealers aren't really thrilled when people make really good life decisions that involve leaving drugs behind. So he told her, give me the car and I'll stop bothering you. Otherwise, you need to keep buying crack from me. And she said, no. That's some choice words, apparently. And so he paid 4 other women $5 to beat her. They beat her with some metal pipes, and they killed her. So that was one of the more difficult moments in ministry for me, was coming to work, and I've had a lot of folks pass away on the streets, and several murders. But to hear that Julie, someone so close to me that I cared about so much, had been beaten to death because she did the right thing, and because her family cared about her, that these factors led to her death. So Julie's resurrection isn't the one that we'd hoped for. It wasn't moving into the cottages and taking advantage of the new life or anything that City Square or Highland Park or I could have done for her. Julie's resurrection was something that only Christ can do for us. And so at the end of the day, when I come to terms with how inadequate I can be and how limited all of our resources can be, I'm so thankful that beyond everything, beyond life itself, there's a new life with Christ. And one day, Julie and I are going to sit down with another cup of coffee. She's going to steal all the sugar she can in heaven. And I'm just really excited about seeing her again.
So the point and the purpose of our faith in Jesus has to do with resurrection. And we know that resurrection does not come without suffering. And oftentimes when we talk about resurrection, we talk about it as this optimism or as something that can't exactly be reached. But what I love about Jonathan's story is that when we talk about resurrection, we're not just talking about resurrection in the next life, but we're talking about resurrection in this life so that we might live our lives here and now in a way that might lead to resurrection of our relationships, resurrection of our value of ourselves as we see ourselves as children of God, and maybe even resurrection for our neighbors and our community who's looking for justice.
So our faith in Christ often comes from a variety of experiences, but the next story that we would like to share with you is a story from Cheryl Bishop, and it's a story about where she really felt the presence of God reaching out to her. And it reminds us that often we see God in things that are very ordinary. Often we experience God in things that are quite extraordinary. And sometimes it's a combination of both.
I think the most memorable one was a time I was probably about 14 or 15. And it was in the Good Friday service at the church where I was growing up. And the stained glass window has Jesus in the center, and in one hand he's holding, the globe with the cross on top to represent he's King of the world, King of all. And the other hand is extended forward. And I think it was a time when I was just so keenly aware of who I was becoming and struggling with that in the midst of high school age things. And as the lights went out and they stripped the altar and it became completely darkened except for that window, I really felt like his hand was reaching to me. And I think in the midst of understanding that was Jesus, but also the full weight of feeling God's presence on my shoulders, that it was just one of those moments that it was, you are mine, and you shall be comforted and cared for. And I think that's probably one of the most dramatic experiences I've had.
So did you know in that moment that you were experiencing the presence of God, or was it in reflection after that you really realized that's what was happening?
No, I think in that moment, I felt like those words were being said to me, you are mine. I think most of the time when I experience God's presence, I feel truly surrounded, whether it's in the ocean or swimming or in that darkness. For me, that it was just the weight of the presence, and not a weight that's hurtful or harmful, or more of a wrapping up kind of presence. And I was very aware in that moment and had a very tearful response to it. And I remember my parents thinking, are you okay? Are you okay? I'm great. Yes, I'm fine.
Better than ever.
Yeah.
So for Cheryl, when she experiences the presence of God, she often feels surrounded by God. And many of us may have that experience. Others of us may experience the Lord in different ways. But I think almost every believer that I've spoken with have had some sort of experience where they've felt God taking them by the heart and saying, you are mine. You are my child. You are loved. And when we experience that sensation, I think the response is very often to reorient our lives to be more of a reflection of God's dreams for how we live, for how we honor God with our lives, and for how we treat other people.
What we recognize about the presence of God is that we experience that not only in the moments that are joyous and happy, but also in the most painful moments of our lives, moments when we struggle and when we are suffering. That's why we believe in Emmanuel, that word that we use for God that says that God is with us. The next story that we want to share with you is one of a time of heartbreak. It's a story that we have from Pastor Jill Jackson Sears, and it's a story she almost didn't share with us.
So your opening question,
Yeah.
I dodged.
Okay.
Did you notice that?
I did, but it's okay.
Well, you could have called me out on it.
That's
I
okay.
really would have been okay with that.
Okay.
But I was thinking about it, personally. And there are lots of places, lots of stories that I could tell. But I think one of the most meaningful moments in my life was early on in my marriage. We really wanted children, and it just took a while for that to happen. And when it did, we were so excited, and I told my church quickly. Around 10 or 11 weeks in the pregnancy, went in and found out that I was miscarrying the child. And that was devastating to us. It was physically, emotionally, spiritually painful. In all of that, in that experience, I remember having a vision. And I know it sounds weird, and whenever you tell people you had a vision, there's some question marks that arise, but I really do believe. I closed my eyes and was praying to God in that time and saw Jesus's arms outstretched on the cross. To me, not only was it an expression of Jesus opening his arms to me in that time of pain, but also it was important for me to remember that Jesus knows what suffering is. And that God knows what suffering is, and that I wasn't in it alone, and this wasn't anything that God was doing to me, but that God was with me. That moment carried me through and really transformed my faith. Out of that, I've been able to witness to that moment because it's something we just don't talk about in the church very much. And a lot of people go through miscarriages. It is the loss of a child.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about it, and we pretend that it's not there, but it is, and it's real, and it's hard. But to know that God is with us, God knows what it's like to lose a child on a cross, there's some comfort in that I think we can hold on to in the difficult times.
The impact of Jill choosing to share her story, not only with us, but with her own congregation, helped remind us that when we share our stories, we recognize that loss is not something that we each individually experience. When we choose to share our story, even when it's a story of pain, God draws us closer to one another, and God draws us closer to God's self, because we recognize that God experienced loss as well. And so we are not alone in our pain.
Pain is a normal part of our existence. And as we've talked about, Christ himself experienced pain and suffering. And grieving is an important process for us to go through in the midst of pain, in the midst of loss. And on the back end of that grieving, it is important for us to continue to persevere, for us to draw upon the hope and the strength that Christ offers us through that resurrection. Here is a story that Stan Copeland shared with us about continuing to persevere and getting off the rock.
You know, life was just so good. I mean, it was just everything that I had been preparing to do in seminary, I was getting to do in the charge where I was serving. And, you know, we kind of had an idea of the future, didn't know exactly what it would be, but it involved schooling. And now we were new parents. We even had a Labrador retriever, and she had puppies. And so I told Tammy, I said, you know, life is so good. Every year we ought to either have a baby or a litter of puppies. And she said, we're going to have lots of dogs. But Zach was 6 weeks old, and I was at a midwinter camp with a group of youth and got into a football game with some kids, and one of them ran over me, and I thought I'd broken ribs, but I went to the doctor, and one test led to another, and by the end of that week, my doctor, who was a very good friend, he said, I think you have leukemia.
Oh, wow.
So the next week I was in Houston having a bone marrow aspiration and biopsy to determine whether I had leukemia, and if I did, what kind. And the kind I had was, at that time, was not treatable, and it was usually fatal within 3 years. I can remember distinctly that weekend after that Friday when my doctor said what he thought it was, and we were making plans to go to Houston for the further tests. I spent most of the weekend on a red sandstone rock in the middle of a hayfield, just having my conversation with God and expressing my frustration and anger and not knowing where to go from there. And before that weekend was up, it was like I had this sense of God's presence with me. You know, though the future was very uncertain, I did sense that God was telling me to get up off the rock and to go right back into life, whether that meant for 3 years or for 30 years or however long it meant, to just trust and to move forward. So I did that, and I moved to Houston. We did. I began to serve at First Methodist Church in Houston. And while there, I was treated at MD Anderson Hospital, and I was put on an experimental drug protocol because there was no other treatment. It was really a failed protocol. Only 2% of the people on the protocol responded like I did.
Oh my gosh, only 2%.
Only 2%. And
wow.
my body started responding to that drug, and after about 9 months on the interferon, my doctor said, you know, what was 100% Philadelphia chromosome positive is now just 90%. And every 3 months, it, you know, went from 90 to 70 to 50% of my cells being healthy, and then more cells healthy than were cancerous. And, you know, after about 1.5 years of that treatment, we were with some seminary friends. We had gone on our annual vacation together, and my nurse called, and she said, Dr. Copeland, are you sitting down? I said, well, not really. And she said, well, I just need to tell you the results of your your last bone marrow aspiration, and that is we couldn't find one single Philadelphia chromosome. And so I could tell you so many stories of how God drew close to me in the midst of that struggle. And oftentimes that was in the form of people who were just like angels, if you will. They were messengers from God. There was a farmer from Georgia named Bill. He had the very same kind of leukemia I had. He had the same doctor, the same medicine. He was such a strong person of faith. I remember he was dying, and I was not. And I felt so guilty. I'd go into his room. I remember the last time I visited him before his death, his mother was in the room, and I came in the room, and you could tell the end was near for him. And he asked his mother to leave the room, leave us alone. And he said, Stan, I need you to know something. You don't need to feel bad for me. He said, I know where I'm going to be. Tomorrow I'm going to wake up with Jesus. And he said, you need to realize that you're going to get well, and that God has a lot yet for you to do. Now, I'd been told that by other people, I'll have to be honest, but coming from him, it was like a prophecy. And, I left that room, and I came to believe that there's a difference in a cure and a healing. My friend was truly healed. He wasn't cured, and he would succumb to the disease. But the peace that he had in his dying was truly a testimony to his healing. From that point on, I was able to pray for myself in a different way. I was able to pray for my healing, whether that accompanied a cure or not. So God really drew close to me in the midst of a time when you do question God, and that's natural and normal, and I think we should not discourage such questioning. God's surely big enough to handle it.
Absolutely.
But we do need to realize that God never, ever leaves us, and is always there to sustain us.
A defining moment for any of us is to realize the difference between being cured and being healed. To know that through our healing, we are able to draw on the strength of God to continue to live the life that God calls us to, be it for 30 years or for just 3.
The last story we want to share with you today is a story from our very first episode with our senior pastor, Clayton Oliphant. Clayton's story is one that is not only powerful and transformational, but it's also one that calls us to learn how to listen for the voice of God.
I went through an 18-month period starting 10 years ago, 11 years ago now, where my father died and my brother, just a few months later, was diagnosed with a brain tumor, brain cancer, and he died within that year.
Oh, wow.
And then my mother died on the heels of my brother's death, all in 18 months. And I remember I was preaching after my father died, and I didn't want to be there. I was preaching a revival. They were singing. They were ready, kind of warming up the crowd, and I'm going to go on and preach. And it was like this nudge and this voice that said, well, do you believe this or not? Do you believe in resurrection or not? It was like I was given strength to go do this work I was called to do. And all through that very trying time, people would ask how I was doing, and outwardly I'd say, oh, we're doing okay. Inwardly, I'm just sitting there going, you go through 3 major losses like that.
Oh, yeah.
I was so broken, but this voice, this nudge, holy nudge, whatever you want to call it, I definitely experienced, God's presence in that, and basically saying, do you believe this or not? But, through all of those struggles, I don't know, some people get mad at God. I got mad at God for a little while, and then I realized, God didn't go around doing these things to people. It's life circumstances. God's the one who's crying with us. God's the one who's giving us the strength to get up and get moving. God's the one who is showing up and pushing me forward and offering new life. So, that's probably the most personal way I've experienced is through those deaths. It's just like, wow, and God showed up. And when Paul talks about the peace that passes understanding, it's that calming presence of God with us.
What we've heard in each of these individual stories today is the reality that our stories define us. They can motivate us, they can strengthen us, and ultimately they help us to find ways to move forward in the world. There's a quote by Patrick Rothfuss that says, "It's like everyone tells a story about themselves inside their own head. Always. All the time. That story makes you what you are. We build ourselves out of that story. Our stories build who we are, how we see the world, and how we will move forward in it." Maybe today, from hearing these great stories, we hope and encourage you to tell your own, to see yourself in the story, to see how it has defined you, and ultimately maybe even to see where God has been in the midst of it, and how through your story, you can encourage and strengthen others and define your life through words of hope and grace.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of More Than Sunday. We've got a new episode coming out every Wednesday, so make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or on YouTube so you don't miss our next episode. If you want to find out more about the Access community here at First United Methodist Church Richardson, you can find us online at accessfumcr.com, as well as on Facebook and Instagram. Make sure you tune in next Wednesday when we have a conversation about conflict and tension. Have a great week.